I have told this story many times, yet each retelling alters the edges. It starts as most know it, that late-night broadcast, when a caller reached Art Bell's show in the fall of 1997. Coast to Coast AM, the voice cracked, terrified, words spilling faster than breath could manage. He spoke about having worked near Area 51, about maps, about populations that weren't human. His speech slid toward panic, and then, without warning, the line fell into static so sharp it cut. Seconds later, the satellite relay dropped. Dead air. Just like that, gone. Listeners remember their nights differently. Some insist the broadcast carried through unbroken. Others recall only the silence and confusion, as if they had tuned into absence itself. Memory splinters. Arguments have run for decades. Was it staged or sabotaged or just coincidence? Speaking it aloud, this old rumor feels too fragile to hold. Yet when I thread in my own recordings, sleepless nights spent hunched near a worn AM band dial, the event hardens into something documented, not imagined. My cassettes offer proof, but even proof corrodes if it contradicts what public archives declare. I play my surviving copy again. The caller's voice trembles. Each inhale rasps like lungs pressing against fear. The words themselves nearly blur in their urgency. Beneath all that something steadier. A soft undernote, constant, like air conditioning heard through the wrong wall. A hum, not a technological glitch, not the rough gain of an overloaded line. Too round, too uniform. Present even in silence between his sentences. It does not shift with his panic. It holds. I had not noticed it all those years ago. But on re-listening tonight, it takes center stage. The official online archive sounds different, cleaner. The caller still panics. The line still drops. But the hum is absent. Stripped out. For decades I carried the tape, believing it was no more than curiosity. Now I hear alteration. My copy feels raw, imperfect, human. The public file plays engineered. Somebody had decided which version of history would circulate. The rest of us learned to remember what we were given. But my cassette disobeys. That single band of hidden tone, threading steadily below fear, becomes the reason I cannot dismiss the event as folklore. I check the cassette housing in my hands. Labels written in my handwriting, 1997. It still smells faintly of burned dust from the player where I left it too long near heat. My pen scratch notes into a current journal. I lay them out with times and frequencies, careful. I feel the weight of that hum. Whatever hides there continues to sound present, even in my quiet apartment. I rest the headphones on the desk, yet the faint vibration lingers against my ears. Imagination or not, its steadiness presses closer the longer I refuse to play further. I replay everything on loop. I catch details the way a grieving mind repeats loss. His breathing falters mid-sentence, and the hum grows clearer within that emptiness. When the feed dies, the tone doesn't cut as sharply as the voice. It continues a half beat into the blackout, before trailing into rough static. That half beat haunts me most. It does not behave like station interference. It behaves like signal persistence, as if something transmitted separately from the man himself. In those last microseconds, the call's authenticity exceeds all denial. You cannot stage what sits beyond collapse. Night drags toward dawn as I catalog. My notes scatter across the desk. Questions spiral wider, yet the shapes blur together into one certainty. I thought this investigation would belong to myths, to late-night conspiracies for strangers craving fear. But it doesn't. The sensation is intimate. That voice dragging through static reaches too far inside me. Unwanted recognition stirs beneath rational inquiry. My hands shake. I close the journal and breathe shallow and dark. I do not yet give name to the connection. Not yet. For now I pretend distance remains. Pretend I can still separate work from life. Something in me knows that's temporary. The voice carries weight heavier than curiosity. I picture my apartment walls pulsing faint with the same hum heard decades away. If that voice truly crossed public waves once, what keeps it from crossing again? A phone line, a station feed, a hidden layer under every recorded broadcast, waiting for ears positioned just right. These thoughts knot my stomach. I rub eyes raw yet cannot sleep. When I stop writing, the silence itself insists on being logged. I feel compelled to keep everything. Because if not me now, then who? The anomaly becomes mine. My hands press to the journal cover as if sealing pact. I vow, I will chase consistency behind this hum. Will measure, compare, match across versions until I understand why my memories conflict with official narrative. Others debate online endlessly about whether the call ever occurred. I no longer care to convince. I only care to follow the part left out, the drone that persists no matter what. Tonight it stirs like breath against my ear. I end this night convinced of one thing. The voice is not finished with me yet. The morning after that restless night, I carried my journal and tapes to a spare desk at the public library. Their fluorescent lights hummed above like cheap ballast, different from the hum that haunted my cassette, yet enough to set my nerves high. I had resolved to cross-check every physical record I could obtain from the night of the broadcast. The task felt clerical at first, the way conspiracy always begins, with paperwork nobody wants. I requested transmission logs, small sheets covered in neat, stamped time codes. Each line marked modulation, each dot a measure of continuity. The logs arrived in gray folders. Their lettering looked faded, but the columns carried certainty. According to these records, the station feed remained strong until, precisely at 1:18 a.m. Pacific, when an unscheduled outage struck the satellite relay. The interruption lasted 69 seconds. On page after page, the neat marks grew uniform again, as if nothing had happened. I stared at the clean return of order. Too easy. That precision unsettled me more than any exotic tale could have. I copied the outage data into my notebook, numbers burnt into the lined paper. I phoned a friend who still worked in broadcasting. His voice crackled down the line, casual at first, until I read him the entries. Transponders, he said, rarely fail mid-segment. Dropouts arrive during scheduled uplink shifts or weather-driven anomalies. This one sat suspended in context, a perfect surgical cut. I imagined scissors closing on a fragile thread. My friend coughed, said he couldn't discuss details tied to corporate contracts, then schooled his tone neutral. The call ended with a hollow click. His reluctance only deepened my certainty that this event was more than happenstance. Back home, late evening pooled against the blinds. I spread my cassettes across the desk once again. 2 separate recorders from the same night, both of which I had stored for decades. I played each tape repeatedly, scanning not only for the frightened caller, but for the mechanical skeleton beneath. On the first, the line drops without warning, the silence abrupt, like all official versions I'd heard elsewhere. But my second copy differed. Just before the dropout, a tremor burst quick and sharp, a high-pitched warble half a second long. The warble cut through me. Thin, piercing, like metal struck against glass. At first I wondered if the machine itself had introduced it aging belt discrepancies, oxide decay. Yet the recorder's mechanics had always been clumsy, never precise enough to forge something so clean. The burst carried intentionality. I leaned closer, rewound, repeated. Again and again. The pitch seemed to flex around the heartbeat in my ears, until even silence after playback carried phantom ringing. I scribbled everything into my journal, warble 0.5 sec before outage. My handwriting slanted unsteady the more times I replayed. Once I set on comparison, unease gnawed deeper. Every syndicated version I sourced online contained no such incident. Clean silence bloomed instead, engineered to swallow the moment. If this half-second could vanish from official memory, then what else had been erased without notice? My mind sketched phantom edits across history. What if every silence I had ever heard was chosen, crafted, intentional? I checked my window for the first time in weeks, half expecting someone with headphones mirroring mine, keeping track of what I was listening to. Paranoia sharpened ordinary glass into observation posts. Sleep proved impossible. At midnight, I forced myself to use professional headphones, heavy, tight cups that sealed the skull. Playing the tape through them escalated the sound to something bodily. The half-second warble thrummed not just in my ears but against ribs and pulse. I tapped my foot involuntarily in sync with its rising pitch. The sensation unnerved me, as though my heart were being coerced into rhythm. Sweat prickled at my shoulders even though the room sat cool. I pulled one cup loose to break the spell, but silence felt wrong, as if unfinished. I returned to the warble. We convince ourselves recordings are passive, memory frozen on tape. But here the artifact behaved like an agent. With every loop, my body anticipated its arrival, the breath of the caller, the swelling panic, then that crystalline burst that guided pulse and lungs together. I lost track of repetition. The tape spun, scraped against the auto-stop, clicked back to begin. Hours dissolved. By dawn, my hand had drawn the warble shape into the journal margins, jagged, sharp, triangular peaks. Repeated like a coded insignia, I could neither decipher nor ignore. In daylight, clarity should have returned. Instead, the residue clung. My phone rang with a wrong number, and I swore I heard the same frequency bleed faintly as the stranger hung up. A truck outside hit its brake pads, squealing at pitch identical to what I had heard in headphones. The world echoed that burst back, stitching familiar noise into reminder. I pressed palms against ears, yet internal vibration continued. Listening no longer felt optional. Listening had changed something physical in me. Each hour convinced me further that the act itself carried consequence. Expanding beyond the tape, I thought of the caller himself, voice unraveling across a line neither local nor safe. What had he heard right before he was cut away? Did his own body sink against that same treacherous half-second? The question burned across my sleepless mind. I realized I was no longer documenting a curiosity, but rehearsing an infection. If archives can be smoothed, then tapes can be planted, altered, weaponized. Where evidence falters, only body remains as register. And my body now carried resonance, unwilling. I breathed shallow, forced pen to page, ending only with the promise of more pursuit. I spent the following days trawling obscure forums. Those digital back alleys where old radio junkies and conspiracy diehards seemed to linger. Posts stretched back years, threads half broken, coded with handle names that sounded more like monikers scratched onto restroom walls than identities. The same debates cycled endlessly. Was the Area 51 call real? Did the satellite relay truly fail? Or was it just Bell staging drama? Buried between recycled hearsay sat something tangible. Offers to trade original re-airings taped on physical media. Cassette, minidisc, in rare cases reel-to-reel. The language was obsessive, each post protective, like handlers of relics. I initiated trades discreetly, careful to mask myself among collectors. Most wanted only to argue. A few shared clips, copies indistinguishable from public versions, except for hiss and degradation. Yet one message startled me. A retired engineer, username folded in numbers, claimed he owned a reel-to-reel direct from a station broadcast loop. His words rattled with unease. He said it carried the ghost underneath. When I pressed for clarification, he grew cagey. Not voice, not interference. A bed that carries something else. He offered to post transfer files, hesitated, then finally sent a large compressed archive. The reel-to-reel sounded immediately different. The hiss had width and texture, heavier than on cassette. Within seconds, my gut clenched. Under the caller's desperate panting came faint syllables, not fragments of voice exactly, but the rigid mechanical cadence of numbers. 9 digits at a time. Pauses measured evenly, as though an unseen metronome guided them. They spilled through the static, half swallowed back into the caller's fear. On first pass, I told myself it was confirmation bias, the brain dragging order from chaos. But replaying, isolating treble and bass, my ears knew better. The structure was deliberate. At 2, a .m. I tapped coordinates into search tools. No results matched. No airfields, no known installations, no latitude that placed sense on common maps. A barren scattering of points, some even falling in open ocean. Yet still, the rhythm nagged familiarity. The pattern of reading aligned like code, passed hand to hand over years. I froze at the thought that the caller may never have spoken those numbers at all, that they existed beneath him, stitched into the hum itself. Perhaps his terror had been no more than cover for the insertion of this deeper cargo. Curiosity overran caution. I connected the transfer to an isolation filter I had borrowed once from a technician source. A simple EQ rig meant to peel residual layers. Slowly twisting dials, cutting treble, leaving the low body of sound. The hum thickened, pressed into me. It came like air pressure, a cabin sealed too quickly. My temples throbbed, blood pushing against skin. I yanked the volume low, yet the sensation remained. The longer the hum lingered, the more it became physical, not acoustic. My body reacted even when my ears rejected it. My chest tightened, shallow breaths refusing depth. I powered the machine off. Relief did not come instantly. A phantom resonance continued, as though invisible speakers still leaked waves into the room. I stepped outside into the hallway, barefoot on cold concrete. Still it pulsed in marrow. I pressed fingers into temples, whispering to myself that silence should have returned, that no machine powered, that only my body betrayed me. But silence didn't arrive with the click of a switch. Long after, my pulse still leaned in rhythm with the ghost behind the tape. I realized then I had crossed a boundary. For the first time in years of obsessive audio scavenging, I avoided returning to playback. My journal page stayed open on the desk, pen rolling idly across margin spots. I couldn't bring myself to write neat entries, only sketch numbers the way they had rattled across static. Shapes of coordinates filled the line borders like a scratching compulsion. The engineer had named it aptly. A ghost. Not spirit, not voice of the dead, but something weightless yet unavoidable, rising with each replay, refusing erasure. It haunted not by presence, but by the stubborn failure of silence to reassert itself. Hours later I lay in bed, but even when my body folded toward sleep, faint mutterings rose like memory bleed. Digits whispered without mouth. 372. 511. Always halting with the same unnatural cadence. My rational thoughts fought down panic. Dreams should not carry imported tape residue. Yet the sequence repeated behind eyelids. I awoke with jaw stiff, hands clutching nothing. The clock read only minutes past since I had closed eyes. What lodged inside me cared little for measures of night or day. I realized I might have invited it in by amplifying too far. The paranoia shaped even mundane tasks. My refrigerator motor groaned, and I swore tonal peaks matched the warbled structures on tape. Buses passing outside carried rattle in rhythm with digits. Random noise acquired intention. At the edge of each perception, I sensed the ghost bending the world toward its frequency. My rational brain resisted, blaming auditory pareidolia, my exhaustion. But my body's reaction refused to be reasoned away. The pressure lingered in skull like altitude sickness. I caught myself pressing palms hard against ears again, as though to squeeze the incorporeal out by force. Nothing helped. I forced myself at last back to the machine, desperate to confront obsession with evidence. yet my hands trembled when they touched the power button. I stared instead at reels motionless on spools, clear tape wound tight across rollers. I couldn't risk energizing that pressure again. I admitted what I had avoided. I had turned a corner in which the recording itself carried consequence beyond data. Listening felt equivalent to crossing the threshold. I was no longer consumer, but participant. I marked in my journal only this confession: ghost outlasts sound. And with that I closed the book, unsettled by how much still lingered inside me. The decision to move beyond private recordings felt necessary, almost like an instinct for survival. It no longer seemed enough to circle the same tapes in endless replay. If the ghost underneath those reels was real, then some official trace had to exist, hidden within archives meant for no audience except internal clerks. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests, wide and cumbersome, trying to bait any detail tied to the station outage or transmissions around Nevada during the precise week of that call. My letters felt stiff, bureaucratic, but behind them beat desperation. Weeks later, a thick package arrived. Torn manila, postmarked from a government facility I did not recognize. Inside, photocopied pages reeked faintly of smoke. Their edges were browned, brittle, curling as though left near flame. The markings across the top said, "Release copy," though whole paragraphs blacked out as if names and coordinates were too volatile to survive daylight. I flipped page after page, trying to keep breath steady. Buried inside were repeated references to unexplained disruption, Nevada Desert Monitoring Array. Technical phrasing cold and clipped. Stripped of color, yet undeniable. Disruption, array, Nevada. These words opened a seam. I leaned close, magnifying the shafts of gray toner as if eyes could stitch back obliterated meaning. Footnotes half visible beneath sensors teased more than they gave. Someone had once written fully, only to be erased later. Charred edges and ink bleed suggested mishandling or deliberate weathering. Still, the references sufficed. They linked the myth of a caller with a record of interference. The gap between rumor and state file shrank, though only barely. My own notes grew hurried, messy, as though pushing to match deliberate redaction with frantic penciled insistence. The act of copying became performance of defiance. I dug for secondary traces. Regional newspapers from the late 90s sat in microfilm drawers. Threading brittle spools, I scanned pages of mundane headlines, budget proposals, stray accidents, sports recaps. Then, a line buried low on column 6 of a neglected desert newsletter. Transmission anomaly reported by air control monitors. The story itself spanned 4 sentences. Uncredited, hedging everything with cautious language. No follow-ups. No acknowledgement of cause. Yet the timing matched my nights of tape. Evidence, thin but visible for those patient enough to bleed eyes across microprint. I photographed the text, feeling its fragility like thin ice beneath boots. With each fragment collected, my journal thickened. Page corners bent beneath the weight of repetition. Scribbles turned indecipherable even to me. Lines crossed through themselves as if my own memory had learned to redact alongside the government. I enrolled every lead, legitimized half-glances, circled forgettable paragraphs. The shape of truth failed to emerge clean, settling instead into collage. A ghost of documentation echoing the ghost of sound. As though proof itself refused singularity. And yet the more scattered it became, the more convinced I grew that institution and signal were kin. Each specializing in concealment through proliferation. One afternoon, seeking better copies of files, I returned to the library desk where clerks processed federal releases. The archivist behind the counter, a middle-aged man with pressed shirt and careful glasses, listened to my request without reaction. He flipped through forms, then looked up with a smile that did not touch his eyes. His voice came calm, rehearsed, as though already prepared. Best not to pursue additional documents. What you have is sufficient. The tone chilled me. Not brusque, not hostile, not bureaucratically indifferent either. Instead, practiced, like a script whispered through too many mouths. I forced my own voice casual, thanked him for the assistance, pocketed what I had. But I lingered outside, recording the moment in my pocket notebook, immediately archivist's smile. Certain words, lack of blinking. He had delivered his warning like radio copy. Wrote, no deviation. No suggestion of personal thought. A conduit, not a speaker. I replayed it in my head later, and each rehearsal thickened my suspicion that institutions handle anomalies the way engineers handle static. Apply a blanket filter. Remove what you can. Repeat until listeners forget there was ever more. That realization spread darkly. If official media channels distribute only smoothed accounts, and state files arrive mangled, charred, and censored, then only stray private recordings, mine, and others like me, retain complexity untouched. Truth survives in scattered magnetic strips, fragile as memory, not in any archive bound with seals. This perspective consoled, but also cursed. Because to hold truth meant to guard something institutions declared unnecessary, even dangerous. No relief waited in validation. Only responsibility, unwanted yet inescapable. I saw myself not investigator, but vessel, carrying distorted sound forward because forgetting would not permit it to rest. Nights stretched longer. I replayed those tapes even when fatigue warned against it. Each listening curled deeper into marrow. My apartment filled with overlapping artifacts, government documents splayed across the floor, photocopies curling, notes jammed between pages. Everywhere a kind of paper hum to mirror the audio hum from cassette. Both forms scorned linear clarity. Both demanded the eye to chase fragments into shapes. My breath shortened as though rooms themselves carried interference. I knew, logically, that obsession distorted perspective. Still, I couldn't stop often enough to grant silence its ground. Silence had become enemy, as curated as redacted text. Sitting hunched, headphones pressing grooves into skin, I pressed stop at last. My fingers clung to switch, refusing play again. But the echoes refused to leave. That hum remained, constant, convincing me that turning away would not lessen its hold. It would thrive even in exile, pressing underneath everyday life. Which left only one explanation, one that both relieved and terrified. Perhaps the intent of that call, that broadcast cut and killed mid-sentence, was to make listeners like me unable to stop repeat listening. Perhaps obsession was the design. Perhaps this had always been their point. I had convinced myself for years that this pursuit remained objective, that I gathered fragments only to examine truth, detached and rational. But the deeper I pressed into the recordings, the less that facade. One night, well past midnight, I sat cross-legged on the floor, spools and cassettes scattered, documents spilling like debris from tidal collapse. In the heaviness of silence between playbacks, memory pressed its own recording onto me. A different voice returned from a different year. Familiar, intimate. My brother. His cadence. His breath. The thought cut through me. I had to test it. He had vanished in Nevada, the year before the broadcast. Official explanations boiled down to disappearance in desert heat. Too much distance walked, or a mess too commonplace for print. His photographs on my shelf remained. His old belongings tucked away. Grief builds quiet patterns. I learned not to name them out loud, even to myself. Inquiries closed fast, as if the emptiness of desert permits paperwork to vanish more easily than a body. But that night, with tapes spitting their faint humming truths, I heard something unmistakable inside the caller's fear. My brother breathing. I dug through shoeboxes until I found an old answering machine, covered in dust, plastic yellowed by years. Inside, a microcassette with his last messages still preserved. I hadn't played them in ages, refused, out of cowardice, to test hope against memory. But my body moved faster than doubt. I threaded fresh batteries, pressed play. His voice filled the room in mundane fragments, him complaining about late schedules, mumbling a promise to call again, half laughter cutting through. The crack of receiver echoed faintly. I sat frozen while his breaths punctuated each line, a private rhythm deeper than words. Then came the comparison. I set the tape of the broadcast alongside the answering machine on my desk. Slow, careful, obsessive. Played first one, then the other. Breaths aligned in timing, the faint hitch before a word, the swallow of air caught at the end of sentences. Ordinary mannerisms to untrained ears, perhaps. But to mine, blood-linked, they staggered with sameness. The more I replayed, the tighter my throat closed. Logic fought against recognition, telling me panic distorts. But grief doesn't lie in invented patterns. Grief understands cadence like fingerprint, carried in lungs rather than hands. Each cycle sharpened both resemblance and despair. I abandoned detached note-taking. Pen slid sideways, scrawling lines less like analysis, more like desperate script. I circled keywords, voice, breath, echo. I filled margins with comparisons, percentages that meant nothing. My hands shook so violently, I ruined half the ink with streaks. For the first time, the hum beneath the call became irrelevant background. The human voice mattered most. Truth ripped away raw abstraction and lodged personal. If that caller was my brother, then what cut him off was not chance. A satellite didn't silence him. Something deliberate did. I let the tapes wind back again. Play, stop, rewind. Each cycle 8 minutes, 8 hours. Compulsion threaded forward. I knew I should stop, that dismantling body recognition like this risked turning hope into delusion. Yet I couldn't let go. My heartbeat lying to his breathing. Sometimes I leaned too close to the speaker, straining against air to catch nuance, and clipped plastic dug against my jaw. The machine whirred like shallow lungs. I wanted it to collapse into proof clear, even to outsiders. Yet part of me knew proof mattered less than the recognition already burning in marrow. I thought of the night he vanished. Headlines never printed. Investigations stapled shut. Every story polite, dismissive, quiet. I remembered myself pacing phone lines in our childhood home while mother slept, dialing numbers that rang abandoned. His absence marked by bureaucracy more than evidence. It had turned grief dull around edges. But here was sharpness reborn, too exact to ignore. Hearing him again, even through panicked radio static, ignited ache newly breathed. Myth or no myth, the sound tethered him present. His ghost wove into broadcast. I pressed both palms against eyes until burning pain swelled. The rational in me revolted. Coincidence channeled through desperation, nothing more. Many disguised voices can sound alike under distortion, after all. My training, my supposed discipline, warned strongly against emotional overlay. But there comes a point where emotional truth outweighs analytical correctness. Every second of testimony in both recordings spoke with that certainty. It was him. The call hadn't been a stranger. It was an attempt to break through something larger, broadcast into ears not yet watching. And the fact it had been silenced mid-breath meant complicity. My grief married alarm this time. Stakes shifted forever. It changed my relation to every document sprawled around me. Charred pages, bland microfilm lines, sanitized transcripts, all of it was no longer distant puzzle, but hostile camouflage over family erasure. If officials replaced frantic breathing with static, if they drew neat black boxes across words, then they weren't merely smoothing. They were burying lives. His life, my brother's body. The revelation felt oceanic in reach but needle in pain. One person gone. One voice cut. Still more cutting through me years later. Research collapsed into mourning, disguised as investigation, disguised as mourning again. My eyes swelled, though pen still wrote. I pressed stop on both machines at the same moment for quiet. I thought silence would release me. Instead, silence punished. The echoes of cadence repeated inside Skull, as if speakers still hummed Phantom. I mouthed his words without choice, lips moving not to speak, but to breathe his patterns. I realized that memory itself had become new recorder, storing him louder than devices ever could. If recordings deteriorate, if archives smooth, then grief alone preserves frequency. He had become inseparable from the hum itself, his breathing indistinguishable from the ghost under broadcast. I whispered aloud to no audience but myself that I could not walk away now. This was no longer some hobby tracked through restless nights. It was family returned in distorted waves. The so-called shutdown wasn't accident, wasn't chance. Something drew its blade across the line when his warnings cut too close, truncating voice back into static. My role shifted from curious investigator to brother unwilling to bury silence again. The myth had transfigured into blood. Even if only fragments remain, even if only ghosts answer me back through reels and tapes, still I must continue. I belong to this pursuit now. I met him after midnight, in the kind of diner that stays open, without reason. A fluorescent cube at the edge of a dead parking lot. The booth smelled faintly of grease and bleach. He sat in the back corner, leather jacket creased, an ashtray already stabbed with cigarettes. His hands shook when he raised them, long fingers clutching filter tips, breath mixing with smoke. He had agreed to talk only once, and only in person. His eyes darted to the window every time a car passed like headlamps, carried open secrets. He looked like a man who had been running too long. I slid into the crapped booth across from him and set my recorder face down. Screen off. He watched it the way men watch knives. Chain smoking isn't the right word for what he did. His cigarettes seemed to consume him, one packed against the other, no pause to breathe clean air. I maintained shortwave relays, he muttered. His voice sat low, more gravel than tone. I nodded, waiting. He scratched his temple, then leaned close enough for smoke to sting my eyes. That outage in '97, he began. The caller. It wasn't a failure. It was ordered. I pressed for detail, asked who would order such a thing. He shook his head violently, eyes glossed. Too close. Too close to coordinates they didn't want aired. The way he said they didn't need elaboration. The word dripped authority, unseen and untouchable. Still, I asked the question anyway, throat dry. Who are they? His cheeks flushed. He ground his cigarette against glass until filters perforated, muttering that naming wasn't an option. His silence left a void more ominous than details could. Fear rolled under every movement he made. The longer I stayed, the more I felt it infect me. I reached into my bag and produced the cassette player. My thumb hovered before I pressed play. From tinny speaker cones bled the brief warble, sharp and narrow, preserved before the caller's line went dead. The technician froze. His hand tightened on the filter he'd just lit, and ash fell in clumps. His face drained pale. Not station bleed, he whispered. Not drift. That's spectrum bending. He tapped his temple as if the phrase itself risked destabilizing memory. Supposed to be impossible at that scale. You don't want more of this in your head. You don't. The expression, spectrum bending, stuck in my skull, rich with implications I could feel but not name. I pushed him, leaning closer, asking what he meant. He wouldn't look directly at me, eyes fixed on a point over my shoulder. You play it too often. It's like staring straight into a welding arc, he said. Burns a hole inside. Doesn't heal. His words clamped down on me harder than any classified report. Fear radiated from him, not theoretical but lived, ingrained in cellular memory. He stamped the lit cigarette against the table by mistake and didn't even notice. I asked again about coordinates. He shook his head so hard the motion seemed rehearsed. His chair scraped back suddenly as if every nerve inside him rebelled. His jacket gathered smoke like a sheath. He grabbed the pack and lighter off the table, muttering fast enough sentences blurred. Warnings about signals, bodies tuning wrong, hearing things nobody should catch. Then he paced once toward the exit, paused, glanced back at me with an expression that passed between pity and regret, and vanished through squeaking glass doors. The night outside folded him quickly into asphalt shadows. He didn't come back. I sat alone inside the bright, half-clean diner. The waitress drifted between refills, unaware of what had passed in the corner booth. My recorder remained dark, face down, catching only the muffled hum of ceiling lights. I left cash on the table and packed the cassette deck slowly, my fingers stiff with unease. Each object weighed more, as if burdened with extra consequence. His warning had carved itself deep. Spectrum bending wasn't error. It wasn't entertainment. Listening carried cost beyond comprehension. Still, I tucked the tapes carefully. Fear pressed close, yet the need to preserve them pressed closer. Back home the apartment seemed altered. Walls hummed faint, electrical lines shivering. I checked equipment like a man preparing for seed switches thrown, cords unplugged, protective cases stacked high. The technician's words echoed, like staring into a welding arc. I pictured blinding white light scarring retina, irreparable black spots where images used to form. Only here, the damage belongs not to eyes but to memory itself. I imagined gaps cut into recollection, places where names slip missing because too much listening rewires them away. My palms dampened. Still, I moved around the room, double-locking doors, shutting blinds, cataloging gear. Finally, I sank onto the edge of my bed. The tapes rested inside a drawer beneath notebooks, muffled but still vibrating in my imagination. I thought of the cassette's warble, that half-second sharpening against everything I built to protect myself. I wondered if it had already bent me, if my relentless listening already scarred unseen circuits inside. The air vibrated as though current passed through walls. My head pressed back into pillows, but rest would not come. Neurons rang louder than silence. I closed my eyes knowing his fear was now mine. And yet, even trembling, I kept thinking of playing it again. My research widened because it had to. If a signal could bend spectrum itself, then it couldn't belong solely to the dusty myth of one late-night call. I turned to number stations, those bizarre relics of the Cold War anonymous voices, mechanical in cadence, reading strings of numbers into open air without context. They filled hours of shortwave bands for decades, transmitting without explanation, marked down only by enthusiasts with spiral notebooks. Many were Russian, some British, some presumed to be Cuban, known but never explained. I downloaded archives, sampled stacks of reels that collectors digitized, hunting for resonance that matched. One by one I scanned and logged them. Static bursts, robotic female tones, spectral male voices flattened by compression. Each unsettling, yes, but none mirrored the Area 51 anomaly. Theirs felt coded for agents, functional though maddening. What I sought was something different, less about espionage, more about intrusion. For weeks nothing satisfied the comparison. I grew almost grateful, telling myself it isolated the call as unique. That relief lasted until one night near 3am, when sleeplessness pushed me to tune my own shortwave set, bored hands turning the dial without patience. Then something broke the monotony. Amid the droning voices reading digits in Russian lilt, a burst hammered through short, exact. At first only a crackle-like interference, but underneath, I caught it. The same background hum, steady, impossibly uniform, identical to what had haunted the Area 51 tape. Numbers followed, monotone, nearly lost beneath static. But their spacing aligned into coordinates. I froze, hand hovering above tuner. My skin prickled. The words I scrawled later in notebook were jagged, smudged. Coordinates again hidden in numbers. They didn't match maps. My stomach knotted with cold realization. This wasn't old. This was live. I hit record, breath held tight. The tape spun while voice listed line after line, never faltering, never human enough to stumble. Beneath it all, the hum pulsed like heartbeat, disguised as machine noise. I struggled to decide whether this was fresh transmission or an echo feeding backward through equipment, dragging ghosts of older broadcasts into present. Either way, time felt undermined. Once finished, I leaned back in chair, throat dry, aware I had logged something meant to avoid ears like mine. I labeled file with trembling letters, unable to trust even digital naming safe enough. I couldn't keep Discovery to myself. I sent a clip to the retired engineer who had shared the reel-to-reel before. His reply came only minutes later, though the hour was late. Just 6 words, no greeting, no sign-off. You've crossed circuits you can't uncross. No explanation. Nothing more. The sentence itself read mechanical, almost like the monotone number voices I had just recorded. I played his message again and again, doubting whether he had sent it or if the interference itself had learned to answer in his stead. The ambiguity tightened fear into something permanent. That night, I tried to distract myself with ordinary noise music bleeding from laptop speakers, city traffic outside. It didn't matter. Caught between sounds, I swore I heard whispers. Not clear words, but faint sequences counting under the surface of whatever else played. Even when radio sat dark, dials turned down, cords unplugged, the hum carried faint through apartment walls as if interwoven into wiring. Sometimes it pulsed steady near the ceiling vent, other times pressed through floorboards. I shut everything down the router, the power strips, but silence would not resolve. Once heard, the thread refused muting. The apartment grew hostile. Corners no longer held emptiness, but vibrations, subtle rhythms scratching inner ear. I pressed ear to drywall and recognized faint cycling like coordinates pulsed in intervals. I wrote compulsively, terrified of forgetting, scribbling sequences across margins until paper couldn't hold them. My handwriting degraded into loops and scratches as though digits themselves rewrote me. Even sleep lent no escape. I woke at dawn convinced I had dreamed entire broadcasts, though no recordings existed. My chest rose shallow with each breath, body refusing to settle. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave equipment behind. By daybreak, I walked room to room pulling plugs from sockets, stacking radios in closets. Coax cables coiled like snakeskins across floor. Removed batteries. Left devices lifeless. Yet the hum persisted, low and steady, not from machines but from building itself. From circulation vents, from plumbing, from the hum of fridge as if commandeered by alien rhythm. I stood listening with palms pressed against cold plaster, pulse sinking, unwilling to vibration. Fear no longer arrived as abstract. It grew lived. To stay meant to share space with something I hadn't invited, but could not shut out. The more I widened my search, the narrower the circle around me became. At first, people agreed to talk, old radio hosts and producers who had once lived for the strange. Their names had been archived on program schedules, still reachable through university rosters or LinkedIn profiles. I called, wrote, waited. A few answered, but their words came sealed inside an odd uniformity. I can't discuss that broadcast. I signed a non-disclosure. The phrase repeated almost identically across different mouths. Late-night talk radio bound by non-disclosure? The idea sat absurd, yet each voice wielded it with the same practiced cadence. The more I probed, the more doors closed. Some dropped calls as soon as I named the year. Others grew vague in real time, sentences crumbling mid-thought. Yes, I remember that night. It was, and then their voices flattened monotone, before shifting into banal chatter about weather or family, as though nothing strange had been asked. I wrote down pauses exact to the second, arrows pointing where inflection died. On playback, the tape exaggerated absence. Answers collapsed into hollow stretches of silence, as though cut with precision blade. What existed in my ear felt excised once committed to record. That was what unsettled me most. Not simple refusal, but erasure. The gaps didn't feel human, not improvisational awkwardness, but mechanical in intent. I began experimenting during interviews, leaving my recorder visible and then repeating questions with it hidden. In person, I sometimes caught longer answers, twitchy laughter betraying memory. But once I replayed the device, whole sections had dropped away, gone. I scrambled to compare with handwritten notes, hoping to prove I hadn't imagined. My notebooks preserved fragments of detail that recordings no longer carried. Hand ink became more trustworthy than magnetic tape. A reversal of certainty I never expected. Skepticism warred inside me. Was the recorder failing? Were my ears too eager to conjure words into void? To test myself, I ran baseline trials describing mundane objects into the mic, listing grocery items, reading from a novel. Playback returned intact. Only when interview subject shifted near the Area 51 call did silence edge in, replacing amplitude with emptiness. I diagrammed results, jars filled with careful ticks, control segments clean, anomaly segments blank. If machines themselves chose not to carry words, then silence had ceased to be absence. Silence now carried a shape, a will. I sat awake at my desk, scribbling notes while recorders stood dark. Lamps clicked, shadows stretching against surfaces like slow specters. I listened to earlier tapes. Even their silence seemed to deepen over time, yawning larger than before, swallowing air between sentences further than pause would justify. I feared I was feeding the interference by acknowledging it, yet ignoring felt impossible. Silence grew loud. I began to hear in it faint textures, the same pressure I once felt when isolating hum. Like static that had compressed itself clean, disguised as nothing but failure. I pressed harder on witnesses, desperate to hold corroboration in my hands. Old callers who once bragged on forums about remembering the dropouts now denied clear memory. I scheduled conversations over phone. Some began solid, voices colored with nostalgia, but halfway through they blurred like broadcast fading beyond horizon. Answers shortened. Then tone fell flat, delivered as if line had been scripted outside human influence. It was just a show. Nothing happened. Every variation boiled back to dismissal, repeated rhythmically without conviction. As if they were reading the same single page. I felt isolation tighten around ribs. The only stream that survived interference remained my notebooks. Pen and paper untouched, immune to erasure that plagued electronics. I filled page after page, scrawled fast while memory stayed fresh. My desk littered with spiral pads stacked high. Margins ripped from overuse. Yet every complete record deepened paranoia. If silence really targeted magnetic media, leaving my written testimony intact might only prove I was the last willing vessel link the carrier where tapes faltered. Each stroke bound me tighter into witness role I never requested. Ink grooves looked less like human writing and more like seismograph lines recording quake dot as weeks passed. I sensed intention in the pattern. The call wanted isolation. Not conspiracy, not institution, but the anomaly itself pressing sideways into reality, pruning every branch of corroboration until only I remained to hold memory forward. The weight of exclusivity frightened me more than silenced recordings. Why me? Did my resemblance to the missing voice tether me to broadcast? Or had years of obsession tuned me into its frequency? My notebooks thickened into scripture, half confession, half archive. My handwriting decayed, cramped, carved furrows like someone trying to etch soundwave onto paper skin. Every silence around me became suspect. Phone calls paused half a beat too long. Neighbors in hallway fell wordless as I passed, resuming only after I closed apartment door. Even my reflection startled me, lips moving with no sound while brushing teeth, as if silence rehearsed itself in my body. I feared that one day playback would show even my own voice excised. I stared at tapes stacked in boxes. Nothing felt permanent. Nothing but the humming, the warping pressure that always survived. Facts diluted, voices erased, but hum outlived every filter. In the end, silence was no longer safe. I told myself digitizing would be safer. The tapes were old, oxide flaking at edges, any day threatening to collapse into powder. A hard drive felt secure, clean, more permanent. One by one I threaded spools, pressed play, connected outputs into laptop. The transfer bars moved slow across screen, a progress percentage crawling toward preservation. I sat close, headphones clenched, as though watching a child sleep. At first everything looked ordinary: static hiss, frightened voice, background distortions. Files labeled neatly, each archived with date. Relief began softening my shoulders. Then the corruption started. It arrived subtle. Only certain intervals faltered. The ordinary chatter of the broadcast transferred intact, but approached the caller's segments and screens glitched. The progress froze, returned red. My stomach hollowed as the system spat warnings. Unreadable data, cyclic redundancy error. I rerun transfers, skipping forward. Always the same outcome. Call regions alone refused capture, as if physics themselves pushed against duplication. Save attempts created files, yes, but when opened, playback delivered nothing but piercing bursts of mangled distortion that curled stomach. The rest of the broadcast lay clean, untroubled. Interference knew aim. I turned to recovery software. Thousands of tiny hex codes spilled across screen, green text flickering in endless lines. For hours I stared while algorithms bit into broken files, chewing at impossible corruption. But descriptions returned strange. Not random noise, not accident, but flagged phrases like intentional overwrite, as though a hand had reached into bytes themselves. Watching those codes flicker was like watching disease eat cell tissue in microscope slides. Segments decayed in front of me, shifting from possibility to ruin line by line. I sat immobile, knuckles squeezing armrest, heartbeat heavy against ribs. Still, amid corruption, a pattern emerged. Not chance. Certain strings repeated across broken sectors, digits bent out of shape but stubborn, surviving within wreckage. I copied them onto YellowPad, row after row. At first chaos, but gradually coordinates surfaced again, the same warped numbers I first unearthed in real transfer. My hand cramped trying to keep up. The digits screeched across my mind. I closed eyes and pictured him, my brother, fingers pounding digits under duress on the keypad, desperate to send code through air before voice itself vanished. The image tore me raw. Investigator fell away. Only sibling remained. My throat tightened. Notes blurred as tears streaked down ink. Rational detachment disintegrated. I bent forward, forehead pressed to desk, unable to separate methodology from grief. For a moment I wanted all of it gone. Files, tapes, drives, anomalies. Wanted to grieve like ordinary brother, wrap memories rather than crush them into coordinates. But even sobbing, I returned to keyboard. Each flashing line tugged me deeper, unwilling, relentless. It wasn't proof I sought anymore, but connection, some remainder of him lost to desert air. The screen offered fragments. Broken, perhaps, but breathing. Enough to keep me here. Corruption worsened each attempt. I replaced drives, cables, recorders. Results aligned. Call segments rotted, other recording blocks crisp. This was no mundane failure of tape. Technology itself resisted me, like an immune system pushing against intrusion. My equipment whirred heavy, drives clicked abnormally fast, fans coughing heat. It felt alive, proprietary, as though defending a secret it couldn't release. The idea settled. Maybe recording had ceased being passive. The moment I captured those digits, I was no longer archivist. I was intruder. Each copy attempt a violation provoking defense. And somewhere in that defense lived intention. I started imagining computers watching me, retaliating in subtle sways, cursors moving fraction late, audio playback warping like something tugged from beneath. I ran defrags, virus scans. Nothing surfaced. Files remained inert only until they touched Area 51 call. Then something animated, defending, infecting. The repulsion bred terror, yes, but deeper still, craving. Because if resistance was so sharp, truth must be sharper inside. It worked like paradox. The more refusal the machine gave, the more desperate I became to puncture. Denial confirmed significance. I lost hours chasing fragments, feeding drive after drive like sacrificial offerings. Sleep collapsed in shallow waves. I would jolt awake to fan hum echoing coordinates in half dream, half hallucination. I taped paper over device lights, swore they pulsed coherent patterns when stared at too long. I covered laptops with towels. Still, a vibration lingered in room, that same bending hum alive in walls. I would walk barefoot across cold hardwood and feel it tremor through solace. The fight wasn't between human and machine anymore. It was sound versus silence, memory versus void, signal resisting capture. I trembled realizing I had placed myself directly inside its test chamber. So I doubled locks, bolted door twice, taped windows, shut blinds. An absurd ritual, yet necessary to soothe mind-freighted edges. Before bed one night, I whispered to no one that maybe my brother had passed not into death, but into pattern. A consciousness preserved in fragments that resist being archived. Maybe his existence remained because interference guarded him, or feared what proof of him would unravel. The thought sliced both hope and horror. Still, even with that revelation, I slid fresh drives into port the next morning. Convinced that even intrusion itself demanded pursuit onward, I spread notes across the floor until there was no walking space left. Spiral pads bent, coordinates sprawled across margins, papers curling where ink had bled through from late-night fever. Each recovered sequence from corrupted files, each string of warped digits from reels and drives, stacked higher, yet still looked chaotic. I needed order. Ghosts stop being ghosts once they align into structure, or so I believed. So I began plotting them, one by one. Satellite maps sprawled across my second monitor, continents glowing in false color like a body under scan. I typed digits slow, methodical, breath-shallow. At first the points seemed random. Desert patches, oceanic voids, hinterlands far from population. But more lined up on screen, and connections pressed themselves obvious. Straight lines crossed oceans, peaked over towns, then continued. Angles repeated like geometry, pro-written into the globe. My doubling back, overlaying red lines again, they formed lattice. A net. Not cluster, but mesh stretched across continents, indifferent to sea or border. My throat tightened. I zoomed further, overlays pressing denser, until the map looked woven tight by coordinates, like some unseen architect had dropped a fishing rig across entire Earth. Each digit held deliberate place. No accident conjures lattice. And in the middle dead center where threads intersected, desert lowlands of Nevada. Not Groom Lake, not any base identified on conspiratorial maps. Just stretch of nothing recognizable, barren squares of scorched earth. Grid-like soil scarred only by survey tracks. My pulse beat in my ear as I stared at it. Years of chasing myths about Area 51 now looked childish compared to this. My brother, if indeed his voice reached Art Bell that night, hadn't been warning of one secret installation. He spoke from inside something systemic, worldwide, woven. The desert grid on screen absorbed me. I magnified, pixel levels decomposing, yet coordinates still aimed to blankness. That nothing was more frightening than any bunker could be. If you intend a trap, you don't leave signs. You build absence polished smooth. The thought sliced deeper when I considered. If his words never meant to point at base, but to structure itself, then maybe he hadn't just slipped into missing. Maybe he had been folded into this net, a life plucked, caught as demonstration. I leaned back, cold shaking through me, aware how fragile floor beneath me felt dotted that moment. Without planning, I spoke aloud. My voice cracked, unused to air after days of silence drowned in headphones. I said to the empty room, "It's not a place. It's a system." The declaration felt larger than size of my flat. Walls seemed to vibrate tighter. Air shifted weight upon lungs. Some part of me recoiled that by speaking thought into sound, I had entered contract. Silence would no longer protect. The signal had always lived through atmosphere. Why wouldn't it hear voice pressed into vibrations now? My throat worked dry, startled at heaviness dripping the room. Instantly I felt it. A sensation, not audible, brushed skin. The hum, that constant underbed once restrained to tapes, now moved live. Wires along wall ticked faintly. Heater clanged though off. I stared at unplugged radio across desk and swore its speaker dent quivered. I whispered nonsense to test, watched ripples ride forward as if air itself had thickened. I muttered another line. Maybe I'm already in it. And truth pressed like compression wave into chest. Saying it aloud tilted world. It no longer felt theory drafted neatly onto map. It felt condition, ongoing, inescapable. I turned back to screen, but grid lines now looked wrong. Too organized, too patient. My thoughts refracted. What if overlay hadn't revealed system, but rather extended it, used me to replicate itself? By mapping, by connecting, I had built copy in digital form. Coordinates fed back into hungry loops. Computers, drives, hex flicker. They may already serve as conduits. Fear dawned slow and heavy. Continuation itself risked sealing me inside. And with that realization came the question I had resisted since first anomalies. Can investigation itself become entryway? Trap disguised as inquiry? Memory called back to technician's warning. Listening too often sears like welding arc. What arc had I just stared into by speaking alignment aloud? I pressed fingers against eyes, saw phantom lattice grid outlined in red behind lid's coordinates continuing no matter rest. I cracked them open with dread, half expecting net strung across night sky outside my window. Only black city beyond. Yet I sensed lines still existed, just disguised. The system need not remain visible to work. Nets catch because creatures never perceive boundaries until struggle tightens. Maybe silence between broadcasts is thread I never notice until tugged. I sat frozen, pen absent from hand for first time in weeks. My notebooks lay open, but words looked brittle, laughably human compared to structure now vibrating inside my thoughts. Brother's voice returned, fragmented across hiss, repeating digits quick, clipped. He hadn't been babbling mystery. He had been trying to cut through, to name system aloud before lying killed him. If he managed only seconds, what right did I have to continue? Perhaps I already breathed within the system he warned, and every recording since only deepened fold. Yet stopping meant abandonment. Continuation meant entry. I whispered again, timid. If it's a net, then I'm already caught. Saying it confirmed condition no note could hold. My words dropped heavy into air. Silence did not return clean. Pipes rattled exactly once cold, decisive. Screen flickered though no notifications arrived. I pressed hand flat to desk wood. Vibrations shuddered upward like pulse borrowed from soil. For the first time, I feared continuation itself. Writing felt unsafe. Playing back reels felt unsafe. Even breathing near turned-off equipment felt complicit. Yet abstaining was an option either. I sat paralyzed, the midpoint where breakthrough met collapse, unable to decide which direction living still pointed. The package appeared without warning. No postage, no return address, only a padded envelope leaning against my apartment door when I came back from a walk at dusk. The building hallway smelled of dust and takeout. I bent, picked it up, felt the light weight shift inside. Not heavy like a book, more like a cartridge or flash device. My built-in camera, if it worked, would have caught nothing. Half the time the lens pointed away, wrong angle. I closed the door behind me, sat at my desk, and tore the seal. Out slipped a single USB drive. It was unmarked. Black, cheap plastic. No logos. The kind you buy in stacks from discount bins. But its presence at my door seared caution into me. I stared too long before inserting. Ridiculous to trust it on my main laptop, but I couldn't resist. Curiosity always outruns paranoia. I used an old spare machine, disconnected from network. Fingers clenched as I slotted it. Folders bloomed instantly without delay, one single audio file nested inside. Its name was simple, plain, no codes, no long description. Just Area 51 _ call _ clean.wav. The ordinariness chilled more than any strange labeling could have. I pressed play. The file opened crisp. Immediately, I recognized the words of the infamous 1997 caller. The same panicked claims about beings, maps, danger. But here it sounded different. There was no static, no interruptions, no faint hum hidden below. The voice came through even, perfectly balanced, as though recorded in a studio booth. Too smooth, wrong. My ears prickled with unease. This was not the tape I had spent nights obsessing over. This felt curated, an artifact manufactured to overwrite. The voice resembled my brother's tones vaguely, but lacked fragility, lacked tremor. Its cadence floated synthetic, ironed clean of terror. I stopped playback and sat still. The screen glow painted the dark room. I breathed once before pressing replay. My brother's ghost had clung to distortion, to uneven breath. Here, there was none. Every pause cut symmetrical. Every inhale measured. A voice rebuilt to sound credible to skeptics, yet hollow to kin. My palms dampened. I pushed chair back, then leaned forward again, unwilling to leave the file alone. I cued both recordings, the original cassette transfer and this sanitized imposter side by side, ready to play them back in sequence. The clash tore at me. From the cassette came hunched panic, static chewing edges, warble carrying digits like hidden spine. From the wavy file came smoothness, even temperature, void of background. Juxtaposed, their difference felt violent. My ears throbbed. Dissonance wormed between hemispheres of my head until skull ached. I pressed headphones off, massaged temples, but phantom overlap kept ringing inside, like both voices clamored for sole authority and memory. I tasted metal despite not biting anything. I realized then this wasn't gift. It was intervention. Somebody wanted to control which truth survived. An unseen hand curated reality. That realization thickened air heavier than any hum. If they could drop a USB at my door, they knew my work. My nights. Perhaps had listened through walls, through devices. My stomach soured at invasion. Yet fear clarified. If distortion survives in my cassette, but not in their version, then distortion itself proves resistance. Their efforts screamed that fractured version might be closest to authentic. Authenticity now lived in imperfection, in damaged tape loops, not sanitized files with surgical fidelity. Control tries to erase jaggedness because jaggedness cuts proof against its handler's hands. For the first time, I felt directly targeted. Watching blinds sway heavy with late streetlight, I imagined lenses behind them. I looked to USB flashing faint where it still jutted from port, its LED pulsing cold blue, like heartbeat not my own. I shut laptop lid, but glow still leaked impossibly. I yanked device out too hard, breath catching. Even after removal, silence vibrated wrong, like room tuned fractionally off pitch. I locked it away in desk drawer, metal clattering. Out of sight, not out of mind. Even concealed, it radiated. Whispering obligation to choose one version over other. Sleep that night was impossible. I replayed in head the overlap, digital honesty against analog fracture. The cassette staggered, coughed, gasped. And in those flaws my brother lived. The USB spoke easy perfection, too steady for human. Which should I trust? Which should I preserve? I lay flat, hearing faint pulses through plaster, heartbeat not since to mine. I realized no choice existed. The artificial file came designed to seduce, but I couldn't discard the jagged one. Imperfection anchored me. If it corrodes someday, better than obedience to cleaner lie. When dawn cut into blinds, my decision hardened. Whatever force edits history chose to mark me. Fear clawed at throat, yes. Still I understood now my role clearer than ever. I had been noticed, labeled witness, targeted not to silence, but to redirect. But distortion belongs with me. It is my inheritance. It is closer to truth than polished removal. As long as I breathe, I cannot surrender it. Which means from this point forward, I carry burden many will not believe. But the USB proved one thing finally undeniable. I am no longer chasing ghosts. I am being hunted. The analyzer sat heavy on my desk, borrowed from a reluctant acquaintance who worked in signal analysis. He warned me about overuse, about boards sensitive to heat creep, but I waved his cautions aside. To me, this machine was weapon and key both. Its small monitor glowed pale green, knobs crusted with finger grime. I threaded cables into my old deck, pressed play on the warped reels, and watched the screen erupt with peaks and valleys. Rows of jagged lines hissed alive. For the first time, I felt close to cracking open the marrow of those embedded numbers. Hours passed with headphones pressed deep. I scrolled through ranges, cut slices of bandwidth, isolated packages of distortion thicker and heavier than surrounding waves. On the analyzer, the digits should have surfaced, not as voice, but as geometry, visible clarity inside noise. Instead, squiggles trembled across with no resolve. Broken ellipses, splintered stair steps, lines skittering up screen, then collapsing. I scribbled frantic notes, drawing shapes that resembled chemical chains rather than coordinates. Fatigue bit at me. My eyelids burned, dry as though I had been staring into welding flash. Still I pushed further, feeding segment after segment on loop. Once, I thought I caught it. For seconds the figures aligned. A set of paired peaks and valleys seemed to resemble longitude, latitude. My heart stuttered. I circled values in notebook until paper tore. But before I could confirm, they shifted, melting into meaningless stripe. Was it only my exhaustion, hallucinations brewed out of hunger and hours of static drilling remembrance into neurons? Or had the signal itself moved mid-observation, rearranged to avoid exposure? Both explanations felt possible. Neither comforted me. The analyzer crackled, its fan struggling. The edges of screen carried faint ghosting lines, like equipment itself distorted. I leaned too close, waiting for symbols to settle. My reflection ghosted across glass, eyes bloodshot. In those wavering lines I swore for a beat, I saw handwriting, my brother's numerals, the same familiar downward slant. I blinked, and it was gone. My hand trembled as I copied fresh nonsense into spiral pages, half convinced the act had insulted whatever structure lived beneath. What if the effort of decoding wasn't just futile, but offensive? I whispered apology without meaning to, my own voice striking raw in stale air. Fatigue had reduced me to pleading with static, bargained with absence. The machine whined, board running hotter each hour. Smell of dust baked in heat seeped from its vents. My acquaintance phoned, impatient, saying I was pushing hardware beyond tolerance. He accused me of warping circuits, said noise this raw eats metal faster than proper signals ever would. I muttered excuses, holding receiver with one shoulder while scribbling more figures with the other hand. His lecture bled into background. He warned that if I burned those boards, he wouldn't cover repairs. Not for obsession he never understood. I hung up mid-sentence, ashamed but unwilling to step away. It wasn't just wasted time. Failure cut bone deep. Every collapse of squiggles into nonsense became personal, as if the signal refused me. Not misunderstood, but actively withholding. I remembered technicians' words about spectrum bending, about listening being like staring into arc weld. Maybe my effort to decode replayed offense. Instead of invitation, I was probing blind hands into system that tolerated no human interference. No matter sequence I tried, noise reduction, bandpass, low cut, equalization, every method collapsed. Silence mocked me between each futile attempt. The closer I leaned, the further meaning dissolved, like mirage shrinking into desert horizon. Midway through night, my spine bent in pain. I let head drop against desk edge. I watched digits smear together across notebook page into loops meaningless even to me. My pen hovered but refused more marks. My throat tightened with desperation, masquerading as rage. If my brother spoke through these signals once, then why couldn't I follow? Was his language co-opted by system so that only his half reached me, leaving mine strangled? I clenched fists, knuckles pale. The silent monitor flickered faint, as if mocking with patterns no human eye could hold. I realized eventually I wasn't dealing with noise designed to be cracked. Classic codes begged translation, leaving keys hidden for those diligent enough. This wasn't key-based. This was self-protecting. An organism resilient to interpretation. Every attempt to pin down coordinates only birthed rearrangement. A shifting body, alive in distortion, punishing curiosity. I felt like child thrust against machinery of another species, sound waves programmed to elude reading. Over and over, I whispered that this wasn't data. It was intrusion disguised as data. Asking where coordinates led was wrong question. That evening I only asked wrong questions again and again. Yet giving up did not cross. Agitation sat raw, but so too did addiction. Each line of nonsense teased possibility, stuck just out of reach. The act of trying infected me deeper. I had promised once never to abandon these fragments. Obsession beat surrender. Even knowing further decoding might twist me, I tightened grip. My notebooks, my failing analyzer, the piles of ruined attempts, they were evidence of contact. Failure itself proved system alive, striking back. Each collapse hammered truth clearer. Whatever entity threads tones under voices doesn't want to be read. And that truth, bitter and uninviting, compelled me forward. When dawn seeped in, burnt orange across window cracks, I shut machine down. My ears still rang. My palms vibrated. I stacked notebooks high, pages crammed with symmetrical figures that whispered lies. My fatigue crushed but resolve stood sharper. Another approach existed, though not yet known. Silence between attempts crackled thick with presence. I could not stop, not after failure screamed defiance right in my face. If a brother spoke once across those waves, then somewhere his pattern still lived. And if pattern hides, then I must find it. Failure only sharpens hunger, and hunger refuses sleep. The circle around me shrank abruptly, without ceremony. The retired engineer who had once mailed me his reel to reel never answered my last email. Weeks passed, and his silence sat heavier each day. At first I told myself he was old, tired of paranoia, finished with me. But I checked forums where he had once posted habitually, and found his handle scrubbed clean. Threads where he had written replies now carried blank gaps, like whole dialogues had been excised. Screens looked incomplete. My own memory questioned whether certain exchanges had existed at all. The absence spread like ink, deliberate or not. Then came the technician. He who had nervously smoked in a diner booth, muttering about spectrum bending. We hadn't spoken since that meeting, but his number still glowed on my phone list. He began leaving cryptic voicemails at odd hours, no explanation, just curt lines delivered in breathless tones. The worst came at 3 in the morning, his voice raw. "They know what frequency you sleep on." I replayed it a dozen times, dissecting cadence, longing for follow-up that never came. That phrase coiled inside me. What frequency do I sleep on? Could slumber itself be measured by wave? I called him back repeatedly. No answer. The machine picked up, but each attempt uncovered silence. Not automated, not static, but flat stretches with faint hum undercutting. I recorded these voids as if they were messages themselves, archive of absence blooming larger than presence. Fear thickened. I wondered if he still lived, or if his warnings were swallowed into the same smoothed archive that had polished the caller long ago. Days later, his number disconnected altogether, a cold operator's notice verifying he had retreated, or been forced to retreat, into invisible lines where contact collapses. Paranoia spread outward. My inner circle frayed. Friends I once trusted stopped returning calls. Some muttered I fabricated, that I had fallen too deep into myth. One accused me of splicing audio myself in attempt at notoriety. Their skepticism hurt more than official denials because these were voices tied to my history. I caught myself recording their dismissals on cheap handheld device, proving to myself later that they really said these things, that memory wasn't corrupted alone. Each dismissal still carved deeper. My notes shook with rage. I scrawled unsteady lines. Betrayal hides behind every silence. The words echoed even after ink dried dot when the collapse grew unbearable. I turned again to the one comfort I had hoarded. My brother's answering machine tape. I believed in it completely, believed cadence proved connection. Late one evening I pressed play, wanting to hear him again to ground myself. But what poured back unsettled me. The breaths felt different, no longer aligned with the Area 51 tape. The hesitations fell elsewhere, the pattern weaker. His gasps felt rehearsed, artificial, unfamiliar. I lunged to compare side by side yet again, but no longer saw resemblance I once swore to. My ears twisted truth at whim. Panic throttled me. My throat constricted, stomach churned. Had my grief invented him in the broadcast, pulling resemblance out of desperation? Or worse, had the signal itself bent recollection such that memory rewrote to match cadence until the original no longer aligned? In that moment, even past became pliable, no tether thick enough against corruption. The trust I had built fragile, necessary. Entire scaffolding of obsession collapsed like brittle branch snapped under weight of its own expectation. I sat hunched, nails digging palms, teeth grit. My only whisper, what if it was never him at all? I paced small apartment tight as cage. Every wall pressed close. My notebook looked alien now, pages crowded with frantic digits and annotations. If my foundation faltered, then each annotation rotted too. I feared reality had been rearranged not just by institutions redacting files, but by signal itself rewriting sensory anchors. What assurance do I hold that cadence I chased belonged to flesh and not machine teaching me rhythm? I felt like instrument tuned without will, forced to play chords never mine. The thought singed deeper than abandonment. It was loss of self inside system too large. Desperate, I turned recorder on. I spoke directly into its mic. Voice cracked. This is evidence. Tonight my memories fracture. I don't know anymore whose voice lived on the call. I don't know if I fabricated resemblance to my brother. I don't know if the signal taught me to believe. The words spilled faster than I intended. Recording became confessional, not archive. I admitted I no longer knew whom I addressed. Perhaps only strangers decades later. Perhaps no one in particular. Perhaps even the signal itself, twisting honest confession into new fodder. Still, I sent words outward, The recorder listened. Small red diode pulsing faint, like a steady heartbeat opposite my frantic. In that light I found eerie calm. Even if I collapsed, at least one machine mirrored me. Not reliable, no, but present. The sound of buttons clicking into permanence felt miraculous. Perhaps this was my last tether. If memory bends, if friends fracture, if voices refuse reply, then testimony etched against spinning reels exists as placeholder for truth. Whether anyone retrieves it later is less relevant now. Speaking into recorder is act of self-defense, stave against void, threatening to loosen every particle of me. I finished confession shaking, but steadier than hours before. The red light still glowed. I spoke once more for posterity, not knowing whom I served. If the voice was never his, then the battle has already been lost. Yet I cannot discard it. It holds me. Then I let the machine roll in silence for a while, capturing the hum of my apartment, pipes sighing. That ambient felt safer than trust and memory. I ended track only when exhaustion dropped me against chair. My eyes closed, but pulse still tilted fast. I dreamed of nothing but falling into empty tape, hiss dotted with fragments. Small posts on monitoring forums, half dismissed by hobbyists with scanners. A user mentioned short hums bursting across civilian frequencies, then silence so blank his receiver auto-muted. Another described cockpit chatter where pilots complained of sudden interference, scrambling headsets mid-flight. Ground controllers baffled at transients no weather explained. I collected these scattered testimonies obsessively, piecing them together. Each one lined to frequency bands already marked in my journals. The net I once charted in solitude wasn't theory anymore. It flexed across populations, catching strangers unaware. Their confusion mirrored my first fear years ago. I took screenshots of every claim, copying before moderators deleted threads for lack of verification. One day posts bloomed across a website, and by night they vanished, leaving blank comment trails with no reference. This erasure drilled panic. I archived compulsively, filling hard drives with frozen shards, not trusting cloud, not trusting anywhere beyond metal in my hands. I labeled each folder date and forum ID. Inside grew a digital graveyard of testimonies, fragile fossils already scrubbed from public. It felt like watching memory collapse in real time on a population scale. My earlier sense of isolation dissolved into grim collective. The collective intrusion revealed itself further when mainstream users began complaining without context. A gamer live-streaming flight sim cursed his headset feed sputtering, a burst of tone riding just above his eardrum before silence. A truck driver yelled at dispatch about sudden hums that cut his CB line mid-route. None of them connected to myth. None tracked conspiracies. They voiced these as technical annoyances, fleeting ghosts across routine communication. Yet every description matched my database. It was spreading. Or maybe not spreading, maybe always present, only recently bold enough to brush daily lives more visibly. I sat late into night archiving until palms cramped, empty mugs stacked high. Paranoia grew sharper. Each post deleted faster than last. Even small mentions on social feeds blinked away. These weren't trolls cleaning house. They were patterns of removal, guided by unseen hand. Yet erasure in public couldn't erase intrusion in private. Too many lived it firsthand. I whispered aloud one night, "It's already in the air." Hearing myself name, it sent chill spare as nuclear winter across skin. No longer sealed to old reels, dusty tapes, or one midnight broadcast. Signal had entered atmosphere like contagion. My own phone betrayed me next. During a harmless call, a friend spoke of trivial weather, but suddenly the line ruptured into tone I knew like old scar. Low hum at first, then a brief warble almost musical, exactly the warped resonance from the cassette. My veins iced. He kept speaking, unaware, words cut sharp by intrusion. But I couldn't hear him, only that tone blooming across. Within seconds, it collapsed back into ordinary like an audition ended. Curtain dropped. He scolded weak reception. My notes scrawled in urgency. Presence now hijacks routine calls. Technology neutralized as containment. Everywhere susceptible. That one moment redrew boundaries. The sanctuary of ordinary devices fell. Safety I clung to when tapes locked in drawer fractured instantly. Ordinary calls became channels. Family connections, casual talk, everything risked contamination. I stopped answering late-night rings, fearing hum pulsing through rather than human voices. Even my voicemail returned corrupted clips, spikes of tone underneath greetings. I tried discarding phone altogether, yet paranoia persisted. Because if net already strung wide, refusing device made no difference. Air itself betrayed. The hum lived invisible, picking hosts at whim, each interception proving unwelcome experiment, shifting into collective involuntary trial. Sleep offered no escape. Nights found me bolting awake, convinced ears still carried tone residue. Dreams bent toward cascades of digits, mathematics twisting into lattice I had mapped earlier. Bed sheets knotted around me from restless thrashing. Sometimes when silence pressed deep, faint pulses quivered in plaster. I pressed ear against wall like stethoscope. Once I counted a steady series, deliberate intervals, like system measuring respiration of building itself. I pulled away shaking, unwilling to acknowledge what that hinted. Nothing slept. Not air, not walls, not me. Rest had been exiled for good. I wondered if participants multiplied daily without even knowing. Every pilot blasted mid-flight. Every trucker's CB screech. Every casual consumer shrugging before resuming normalcy. Perhaps this was all designed to introduce contamination slowly, turning anomaly into background noise. To ensure memory diffuses, then hides, embedded so deep few question it. What began as one frantic call has now bloomed. I felt both validation and dread. My journals had swollen with coordinates, hums, theories. Now strangers confirmed it unintentionally. But confirmation brought no comfort. Evidence doesn't ease when threat refuses origin. Experiment has widened, and we are new test animals. In quietest hours, I stared bleak at ceiling, counting slow breaths. Each exhale carried suspicion that frequency tuned me like instrument string. That being host meant to amplify. I clutched recorder close, whispering confessions again. What started as mine alone no longer belongs to me. My words cracked. Because burden had spread, but so had danger. We were all tethered in net, none of us witnessed being woven. Civic silence tries to keep it hidden, but hum, once you notice, never unthreads. I ended confession with only one held breath before fear swallowed sleep again. Multiplication continued, invisible, unstoppable. I gathered what I thought was proof. Flight logs recorded anomalies on civilian bands, bursts timed to coordinates that matched my database. Screenshots preserved before forums wiped clean. Hex strings copied painstakingly from corrupted drives. A dossier formed across my desk, messy but undeniable. I printed hard copies, imagining weight alone could push past indifference. Each sheet smelled faintly of toner, stacked high like an altar to hours I could never reclaim. With trembling conviction, I sent packets to agencies, departments, even a local Congress office. I requested acknowledgement, answers, anything more than silence. Something in me still believed response could alter course. Replies arrived weeks later, and their sameness terrified more than outright denial. Each letter near identical, phrases drained of specificity. Operational concern not applicable. Issue outside jurisdiction. No record of transmission anomalies consistent with your description. Paragraphs cold, rehearsed, free of emotion. The cadence flattened point after point, more consistent than any human hand should achieve. Reading them felt like tuning into another frequency disguised as paper. Bureaucratic tone masquerading as language while actually functioning like countermeasure. No acceptance, no denial. Only redirect, blank corridors leading to nowhere. I realized their strategy wasn't to confront, but to neutralize. That sterile script infected even phone conversations I attempted. Government clerks repeated rote phrases no matter how I framed the question. Like recordings pressed on loop, each voice symmetrical with the last. We cannot comment on speculative material. Always the same cadence, no hesitation, as though words drilled into marrow by daily rehearsal. Speaking with them induced eerie sensation, not dialogue, but signal disguised as person, unresponsiveness polished into armor. Their phrases quivered with emptiness sharp enough to bind inquiry itself. At last I slammed receiver down, aware the act had looped me into same frustration the caller once reached. Meanwhile, time betrayed me. My oldest cassettes began degrading, oxide peeling audibly. During playback, flecks shed into machine, leaving distortion not native to tape, but inflicted by decay. One reel squealed with tension, warped its housing. Another stuttered hiss blanketing once clear warble. I panicked, rewinding and re-recording fragments onto backups, only to find their degradation faster than duplication. Memory collapsed twice, once by external erasure, again by physical erosion. The layered assault left me frantic. Every second I hesitated, hiss swallowed one more breath, one more hint of coordinates. Truth fell through my palms like sand riddled with holes. Staring at flaking strips, I felt despair rush in. What had been my ground tangible proof I clung to now screamed fragility louder than all interference combined. I saw my brother's phantomed cadence fray in real time, his breaths devoured by magnetic dust eroding in air. I pressed cassettes to ear like shells to ocean, desperate to hear remainder before it shattered. The signal had always thrived in distortion, yes, but once memory aligns to physics of decay, even distortion ceases to speak. To lose the tapes meant to lose anchor. I felt naked, stripped of artifact that once substantiated my obsession. Desperation demanded new archive. I pulled from drawer a fresh handheld recorder, cheap plastic but functional. Into its modest mic I began narrating everything I knew. Not analysis, not theories, but mind's entire procession of fragments. I spoke until throat raw, telling chain of evidence, retelling discovery of hum, repeating coordinate patterns, detailing emails erased. I read aloud names of every participant who helped then vanished. I confessed fears, confusions, grief. The red diode pulsed steady, comforting heartbeat, answering mine. Recording my voice directly felt defiant. If institutions sanitized every witness, at least here my voice remained human, unsmooth, undeniable. The irony ragged me. Electronics failed when capturing anomaly, but lived when preserving confession. Perhaps signal itself wanted to exist through such means, human throat as vessel. Perhaps this device too will collapse eventually. But while it rolled, while spools wound, I felt less erased. The very act became resistance against neutralization. Each word spoken into mic carried weight paper letters never achieved. They could redact ink, wipe drives, delete forums. But if my living breaths filled track, then presence persisted, forcing system to confront unconcealed human imperfection. To keep speaking was to keep blade sharp, however fragile, yet resistance bore cost. My lungs burned from hours hunched over mic. My lips cracked, throat coughing disorder. Friends already distanced would call this madness, mumbling to myself into plastic device, stockpiling cassettes of confession. But truth resided not in their approval. Every second spent recording felt like linking chain of testimony across silence that authorities welded. Still, I knew menace continued circling. The technician warned listening meant burning holes inside perception. I feared speaking might spark same damage singeing self until memory incinerated too. Resistance bound me closer to fate I sought to resist. Across my small apartment now sat 2 shrines, fading cassettes, and new confession tapes. Between them stretched entire spectrum of fight against erasure. Each turned hour reminded me the line drawn between memory and oblivion was thin, savagely thin. I wrote and spoke as if leaving record for someone else. But even that hope weakened. Sometimes I doubted that anyone beyond me would hear. Perhaps I was speaking only to void itself, fueling exactly what it intended. Each phrase trained me deeper under its net. Yet still, silence could never hold. To resist meant to speak. I closed last recording drained, eyelids cracked with exhaustion. The red light blinked once before powering down. My throat echoed hollow, as if words left cavity behind. Somewhere beyond walls, hum faintly quivered again, answer to my confession. Institutions might say, not applicable. But my hollowness whispered, nothing is more applicable than witness speaking against erasure. I braced myself then for consequences, because everything I recorded now marked me too. Resistance always pushes cost into marrow. I sensed mine approaching swift. Yet silence would have been the greater death. I set recorder down, aware I had chosen blade's edge. I returned to Nevada as though pulled on wire. The coordinates circled in my notebooks for years, sketched across dozens of worn pages, finally dragged me into their center. The land greeted me without ceremony. Wide desert plains stretching against horizon, sky scraped raw by heat. Silence thick enough to dizzy. But when my boots touched ground, I sensed it wasn't empty. It vibrated. Beneath sand and stone, a low pulse echoed faint, not audible at first but tactile, rising through bones of feet into ribs. A subterranean hum threaded through desert air, deeper than geological, heavier than wind. Hours passed with sun, glaring over cracked salt flats. I carried equipment in packs, looped antennas, bulk recorders. I drove until road fractured into dust, and then walked. Out here lines blurred. Compass pointed steady, but I trusted vibration beneath more. My notepad dampened with sweat as I scratched coordinates over and over, trying to convince myself pattern hadn't unraveled into hallucination. Yet ground reminded me. Kneeling, palm pressed flat to dry stone, I could swear faint quiver-matched frequencies burned into my cassettes long ago. Desert wasn't silence. It was loud with sound just outside hearing. Night fell sudden. The desert turned pitch, horizon shedding hellish orange into black. I set antennas wide, connected wires into recorder, heart tight. Silence stretched sharp, but then faint tones blurted across lines, stuttering first, then steady. Not mechanical failure, not external interference. My devices bled without input, leaking electric resonance into open air. I caught breath. This wasn't memory looping in tape. This was live. Tone poured as though desert itself decided to broadcast. I adjusted dials. The shapes sharpened, arcs crashing across range. I felt each tone hammer sternum, stronger than anything conjured from static in apartment. I swept flashlight across emptiness. Nothing answered, but a sensation pressed down like crowd hidden under sand, living in density, not form. The hum grew spine. I recorded everything, my voice narrating coordinates, atmospheric conditions. Yet when I rewound to confirm, a wrongness jolted me. Under my voice lay others. Faint, overlapping, not clear language but broken syllables weaving like chorus stitched from fragments. At times laughter strained, at times sobs cracked, and buried deep one cadence almost tore me open. Breath drawn in short spasms between words. I recognized it, or convinced myself I did. My brother's echo. Half of him, remixed and blurred. Each time I listened it warped, shifting to both resemble and betray memory. I trembled, hunched over deck, knuckles whitening on edge. Sand shift hissed in distance as night cooled too quickly, desert air crashing from heat to cold bite. I shut eyes, but voices threaded and continued, filling ears even without playback. I parted lips hoping silence would exile them. But silence only birthed echo sharper. Whatever systems churned below had crafted mimicry elegant enough to ensnare my grief. Tears burned unbidden, not just for hope but for cruelty. Hands shaking, I returned to equipment, red diode blink steady in impossible dark. I continued recording. Comfort didn't exist anymore, not out here. But duty remained. Words rolled out hoarse, telling machine what I felt, what I heard. Sky above sprawled with stars indifferent. Yet I sensed boundary between earth and night shuttered by heavy mesh. Net that once drew itself on my maps now physical around me. Footsteps in sand unnerved, though only mine skittering. Still, when I glanced back flashlight beam thin, I swore shadow lengthened beyond my figure. Sand vibrated faint across boot sole. Net pressed close. By dawn throat cracked, lips bled dry, salt-licking skin from restless night. My head pulsed. Still I couldn't tear from deck. Playback offered no clean testament. Instead loops reinforced presence of those half-voices, jittered breathing twinned to mine. Time seemed to collapse. I couldn't parse whether I recorded in present or replayed years gone. Desert didn't care. Breathless horizon rolled, blank yet insistent. Standing there, inhaling cool dust, I knew this trip sealed certainty. The caller's voice, whoever he was, spoke not from Myth-Night radio but from inside systems sprawled beneath here. Family or not, desert confirmed design. I packed slow, reluctant. Every chord folded like artery weeping. Yet as I dismantled, tones flickered despite switch already set off. Antennas still pulsed faintly, drained through cables like afterimage. I noted this cold pen scribble's jag pressure across page. Sunburned, sweat snapped. Desert remained unchanged, but my chest beat wrong, out of rhythm with years of life until now. Perhaps hum aligned me, rewrote pulse nearer to theirs. I pressed palm to sternum, shuddered. It hit. Maybe blood beat itself around echoes, remapped by resonance. Human body as playback system, carrying contamination unseen. I left tracks etched in sand, trailing toward vehicle, shadows short under punishing light. Behind me hiss of wind erased them too fast. Standing at wheel, I stared once more at barren grid ahead. It offered nothing, no towers, no dishes, no evidence. But weight beneath radiated constant. Families lost here don't echo back in myth. They echo in hum, in loops disguised as error. Either it was my brother or voice of desert feeding hunger with memory mimic. Both truths ruin. My only action left was same as always: record, narrate, preserve. Because one day, even sand will erase me. The desert at night tightened my senses until every vibration felt like a sentence. I sat beside the rig, headphones clamped, watching the spectrum analyzer crawl its neon tracings across the dark. The hum no longer felt steady, no longer background. It bent, rose, fell, formed shapes too precise for chance, yet too alien for language. Peaks aligned in curving symmetry, like arches repeated across display. They resembled outlines of doorways, gateways tilted into sound rather than stone. Each glow of the graph pressed conviction deeper. This was no random modulation. It was structure. Invitation concealed as interference. I spoke aloud to anchor myself, reading coordinates again, the same way one recites prayer against fear. My voice came back in headphones, but fractured. Half a second late, not reflection, not echo. The timbre arrived warped, like another voice parallel but adjacent, repeating after me with faint delay. I froze. I yanked cans from ears tested with bare air. Even naked sound still returned doubled, faint, as if environment itself distorted me. Desert floor had become microphone, amplifier, playback hall. Hearing myself answered by phantom copy split chest open. I whispered name, and duplication whispered name back slower. Hushed, I documented feverishly, journal lines jagged under weak lantern. Each entry blurred with sweat and grit, but still I wrote, voice doubling now response not reflection. I felt both terror and awe. If communication had ceased to be simple message, then what spread across frequency was more. Threshold. The hum outlined doorways not metaphor but function. Not telling stories, not encoding secrets. Actual gates lined in invisible measure, shaping space to welcome crossing. When I spoke into that hum, perhaps my speech itself pressed one step into its threshold. Already it twisted words, bent voice against timing, rewriting my edges. Wind caught open desert and carried grains sharp across my cheeks. I shivered though air remained warm. Kneeling near antenna, I pressed palm against soil again, sensing tremor subtle and deep, like engine idling miles underfoot. The line on spectrum tilted higher, widened. Archways multiplied. What awaited beyond them remained unspeakable. I hesitated, foot hovering above gravel phantom waited. Half of me certain that one more step physical or auditory could collapse me into absence. But half more drawn relentlessly to silence that was no silence. I held breath and whispered, "Are you there?" A second later, I heard my own voice reply. The delay cut deeper than fright. It confirmed presence. Not shadow but duplication. Not tape loop. As though another me already waited, answering half a second behind. Lips shaping same words and dimension offset. The shock nearly broke knees. I steadied recorder. Diode pulsed, dutiful, unflinching, marking new entry into archive. I looked back at analyzer, arches glowing brighter, not random but pulsing like signal, anticipated something further. My skin prickled. Doorway ajar. That was when realization struck. Perhaps listening itself was already crossing. Not one step necessary. Merely ears open and reels turning equal traversal. Every night here I had crossed incrementally. Fear begged retreat. Pack gear, run back to highway, forget desert grid. Yet compulsion outweighed. Recorder rolled. Notebook soaked in desert sweat, pages striped with unsteady script. Choice proved illusion. The moment I tuned into hum, system tuned back into me. Each night deeper. Each modulation carved presence across body, adjusting pulse fractionally toward pattern. I felt it sinking ribs, altering chest cavity into resonance chamber. I lifted head and howled faint, sound shivering across dark. Response came delayed, my howl fracturing, pitched slightly higher, as if other version of me grinned behind gates. My eyes blurred hot, still I couldn't walk. Lantern dimmed, flames sputtered. Desert ground brightened only under stars, clusters pinned sharp instead of twinkling. Even above seemed shaped into arch lattice. Sky netting to complement Earth's. I understood then the teaching. Signals weren't messages awaiting deciphering. They were doorways disguised as codes. We spend years translating, never suspecting listening itself completes act they require. Participation equals entry. All along urban myths argued about meaning, while true danger was method. Sit long enough, record long enough, and you are inside whether you consent or not. That truth pressed me down harder than desert air. I stared into trembling analyzer peaks one last time before sleep overcame. Arches widened mathematically precise ratios, ancient architects carved in cathedrals, but here rendered from magnetic distortion. My breath fell shallow. Each inhale mirrored back half-beat late, foreign lungs inhaling parallel. The knowledge sat merciless. I was not alone anymore, never had been since first cassette turn. Another me stood already past doorway, echoing steps, waiting for my ignorance to crumble. Desert sand itched against shin, as though hands beneath stroked gently upward. Recorder still ran, capturing everything not protective now, but proof my choice had been sealed. I built it out of scraps. Aluminum poles ripped from fencing, copper wire scavenged from broken transformers, A soldering iron powered through whining generator. Out here under the desert sky, my hands shook not from heat but cold. Nights turned thin by altitude, breath frosting before lips. I worked hunched, eyes burning from headlamp glare. Every twist of knuckle felt like sacrilege fashioning a doorway rather than just listening. But watching the spectral arches expand nights before made passive observation unbearable. If signal opened gates, I wanted to brace them, stabilize, glimpse what lay beyond hesitation. Curiosity surpassed fear, for once. The crude array looked skeletal, wires spreading outward like ribs from rusted spine. I anchored its joints into sand with rebar, careful alignment by compass and coordinates. Notebook pages pinned under stones rattled in wind as I checked angles, adjusting until lattice faced precisely where peaks had clustered on analyzer. Soldering iron hissed, blue sparks snapping across as hands cramped ceiling joints. Each night bled into next. Stars above watched indifferent, but I felt their cold distance's echoing pattern below. My journal entries grew scrawled, jagged. Constructing an ear for system, I wrote once, appalled by phrasing, yet unable to erase when it was finished. Awkward but functional, I paced circuit until feet left grooves and grit. I breathed deep. Mouth dry. I flipped generator choke. Engine coughed awake. Array shivered alive. First came silence, then vibration. Bare metal sang faintly, not natural resonance but purposeful tone. It exhaled into environment steady, quicker than any tape had achieved. Frequencies spread outward, sweeping hairs on my arms erect, driving pressure behind eyes. Then came feedback. At first low, then drilling minute by minute, boring into skull, vibrating bone, lung tissue rattled against ribs. I gasped, hand clutching sternum. Desperate, yet still refusing shutdown. The sound enveloped everything. No longer through headphones, but immediate, environmental. As though atmosphere chartered into chorus of anguish. My recorder caught wild oscillations, input meters spiking red. I coughed against bitter metallic taste, still scanning analyzer perched on crate. For seconds, impossible seconds, peaks aligned sharp, no longer chaotic lattice. Coordinates revealed themselves fluid, sliding but coherent, like constellation aligning guided stars. Arches bent into symmetry too exact for imagination. I glimpsed through distortion, a lattice stabilizing a hum burning as steady beacon, not corrosion. Doorway crystallized visible in lines on screen, mouth gaping toward me. I froze trembling with awe. The moment snapped. Stability collapsed. Metal shrieked, copper joints glowing cherry. Sparks ate cables. Generator roared before dying. A flash erupted, flames cracked sand, molten grains blackening. Acrid smoke gushed over, bitter plastic chewing lungs raw. I stumbled back coughing, hand shielding eyes as array bent backward, pulse snapping with whip crack. Hum knifed higher, then died abruptly. In an instant, atmosphere cleared. Silence returned absolute and cruel, its suddenness deafening after onslaught. Ears rang until pressure misaligned, leaving me dizzy, stomach lurching. Darkness pressed forward unrelenting, stars once more indifferent. I felt a knees, sand rough under palms, chest hammering disorder. I tasted carbon, tongue acrid, smoke swirling still despite winds. Cables cooled, sagging in melted clumps, black residue scarring once pale floor. My experiment had ended in wreckage, entire proof scattered in ruins. Recorder still blinked, capturing frantic breaths, body rattling like child seized by fever. I forced words into mic, stammered confessions. Yes, coherence existed. Yes, doorway glimpsed. Yes, beacon real. But instruments could not hold it. Metal fried. Skin scorched. Mind stretched thin as solder wire, brittle under any strain. Contact had existed for seconds, but those seconds destroyed. Proof now welded inseparably to aftermath of collapse. I sprawled on grit, coughing until throat raw. The knowledge inside me both crowned and cursed. No denial possible anymore. Doorway existed, beacon existed, system alive beyond fabrication. But human hands lacked capacity to steady it, to study without violence. My scorched array testified. Stabilize wave too direct, and it sears environment, blisters soil, wrecks thought. I remembered technicians' phrase like staring into welding arc. Yes, exact, not extended gaze, not repeated observation, single prolonged glance enough to scar retina of mind. I breathed shallow through shirt knotted around mouth, still shaking. My only clarity. Institutions silence not from ignorance but survival. They know proof cannot be endured intact. They bury not because they cannot grasp, but because grasping ruins graspers. My sides heaved as I realized silence, smoothing, redaction. They were defensive, not only malicious. To contain hazard by omission. My mouth whispered against sleeve, their right to erase. Yet another voice inside refuted instantly. Of course they erase, but they also trap. They keep secret not for protection, but power. Conflicted, I rolled onto back, stared at nets of stars until tears blurred heaven sharp into smear. The truth felt heavier than any desert rock pressing on chest dot when smoke thinned, night bled onward merciless. Array remained collapsed, twisted like carcass after slaughter. Recorder clicked, battery draining yet still loyal. I left it on ground near my chest, whispering new entry. Coherence glimpsed. Stability cannot be survived. Equipment fried. I remained breathing, barely. Proof existed for 5 seconds. Enough. My eyes refused close, terrified of dream echo repeating beacon again without shields. I clutched machine close as anchor. Though fear screamed withdrawal, awareness screamed further. Even failure confirmed rightness. But confirmation always exacts cost. I realized, lying charred in stink and silence, that survival yielded nothing but aftermath. I brought little back with me. Just drives half-scorched from desert air, reels scarred by smoke, and notebooks warped under grit. My body ached from exhaustion, but heavier still was dread. Doors closed behind me as I returned to apartment, the city too loud, too indifferent. I thought walls might act protective, layers of brick sealing away interference. I was wrong. The moment I unpacked, rot revealed itself. The recordings whispered, even while unplugged. My own voice bled through their hiss, but warped, stretched low, then cut high. When I pressed play for proof, I recoiled. The voice in speaker carried my words, but no longer clearly mine. Cadence bent into patterns of that frantic caller years ago, his rasp hitching with panic. My syllables warped into his, our breaths no longer separable. It became unbearable to decide which came first. Was I narrating into echo? Or had every line I believed archived from 1997 already been contamination of my own voice fed backward? I clutched headphones, head dunked in buzzing ocean. My throat constricted. Whatever distinction I used to build between me and him fractured irrevocably. I tried to share what remained. Friends once careful enough to listen now refused completely. Conversations failed. Eyes glazed vacant when I explained, their faces flattening, lips mouthing polite dismissal. Worse still, some blinked slow, responding with lines rehearsed, manufactured sentences without weight. You should get rest. It isn't real. Their words stamped dull like rubber seals. One by one, circles collapsed further away until I carried evidence alone. Eye contact drained of human warmth scared me more than static ever had, as though through them the system answered me, disguised inside familiar skin. Even duplication failed me. Every attempt to salvage files collapsed faster than before. A fresh copy, etched onto portable drive, decayed within hours. Hex windows shredded lines into meaningless stacks. Text editors crashed without reason. Recovery spun loops into corrupted nothing. What I had left seemed to evaporate while fingers still pressed keys. I slumped against desk, feeling futility gnaw. Proof refused permanence. Signal played predator, hunting my archives directly. Each version I saved became quicker to perish, like flesh bruising faster once infected. Library of Obsession collapsed into handful of mutilated clips more alien by day. Notebooks proved no safer. I turned pages disparate to anchor in pen and ink, only to find words shifting mockingly. A sentence carefully described interference. Later, when I flipped back, the letters bent into different lines, still my handwriting. Same tilt, but phrases not ones I remembered writing. Sometimes single words altered. Other times entire paragraphs retold events with confidence skewed, dates wrong, impressions reversed. I gasped at horror of betrayal, realizing not even closest material could anchor me against corruption. If pen leaks into same current, then safe ground evaporates. Nothing remains steady. Not physical. Not even body. No longer could I say signal lived external, inhabiting machines and frequencies. It folded into marrow. Sleepless nights confirmed it. Lying on bed, lungs rising, I felt hum vibrating inside inhalation itself. Each breath sharpened resonance against ribs, chest cavity acting like chamber organ pipes. In silence between exhale and inhale, I heard continuation of tone, never leaving, embedded deep. At first panic shook me, but then numb recognition replaced it. I had become conduit. The net that once spread across continents tightened fully, drawing me thread inside design. There was no boundary. My body was transmitter now. I set recorder on table again. But this wasn't investigation anymore. Not pursuit, not analysis, not hope. It was Archive 1 final stream to exist beyond distortion, should any ears stumble across echo later. I pressed red button, spoke into mic hoarse, and resigned. This voice, no matter warped, persists as evidence. If days fail me, let these reels remain. My words quavered. I named the failures one by one, confessions bleeding raw. Notebooks untrustworthy. Friends hollow. Files corroded. But still, my throat-shaped sound. Still, tape rolled on. Archive now separated me from complete consumption, though only a thread wide. I did not know who I addressed. Perhaps no one. Perhaps only the same net already winding through wires and building around me. But resistance became impossible without testimony. To abandon speaking would mean erasure faster. So I continued, documenting nights alone, recording the breach constructed within chest. I whispered description of lungs vibrating like transformers. I admitted doubling of voice during sleep, mouth uttering prayers not mine. Everything became evidence, evidence more horrifying than memory could hold. Steps echoed too long when I paced floor, as though another version of me walked half-beat behind. Recorder documented my dread. Last I sat shaking in chair, hearing hum rise through throat with each exhale. The difference between speaking and silence vanished entirely. My body resonated, even without words. A tear slid along cheek, salt thick on lips. If this was possession, it was subtle, but complete. My archive bloomed slower as fatigue collapsed head against chest. Light on device flickered valiantly. I inhaled once more and accepted truth. I had stopped chasing caller's voice long ago. I had become him, or rather, equipment had made me vessel through which echoes persist. Final notes, outlive investigator. Hum fills lungs. I let it. I return now to the beginning. To the old night etched into radio history, when a frantic voice bled across Art Bell's show and left the world bewildered in mid-sentence. I held to that voice for years, swearing it resembled my brother, swearing it carried truth no one else dared acknowledge. But all along, my hearing was wrong. It was not warning me about alien populations or military secrets. It was never a map to a hidden place. It was a guide toward entanglement, A door slowly pried open through tape and memory until I stepped through without noticing. The hum threaded each stage, patient, unwavering. At first, I swore it belonged only to machines, artifact of bad recording. Then, I chased it into archivist stacks and reel transfers. Then again into midnight airwaves, where strangers stumbled upon interference, but could not decipher. Now I hear it inside myself, press of resonance stiffening each breath. It has become impossible to say where it resides. In desert ground, in circuits, in lungs. The line between internal and external collapses. The call only showed me first breach, but the breach always intended to widen. I see that finally. Grief bound me long after logic failed. I wanted proof of his survival. Proof that he had pierced silence with voice desperate and true. Each comparison, each playback, collapsed certainty further. If it was him, then he was cut short and lost inside a system alive with cruelty. If it was not him, then I had spent years gnawing my own memory into shape, reshaped by tones that knew how grief consumes. Yet both paths loop to sameness, the hum that holds me loyal. Blood relation turned irrelevant. Whether or not he survived matters less than the threshold reached. Signals are thresholds. I know this beyond doubt. They are not content, not message hidden in code, not puzzle meant for solution. They are doors disguised as noise. To listen long enough, to chase long enough, is already to step through. There are no locks, no rituals, only repetition. That was mistake of skeptic and believer alike. Thinking message required decoding. It required endurance. I endured. So it took me. The choice wasn't momentary. It was long erosion, night after night, word after redundant word scribbled until self-hollowed enough for signal to nest. Doors swung open unnoticed. I set recorder now on desk one last time. Red diode blinks steady. This role will be my final archive. Not as investigator clinging to analysis, but as one who accepted crossing. Proof exists, but only as wound. I speak clearly so someone might later hear. Yet I also accept once heard, it may not remain pure. The pattern hunts duplication, hunts comprehension, and corrupts quickly. Still, I cannot bury silence. My last duty breathes into microphone. These words form tether against void. When they degrade, memory remains faint, humming underneath. I lean close because it deserves plain human tone. My voice shakes. It bleeds into noise already. I do not know how much remains mine. I tell you this frankly, if you can still recognize my syllables, it means threshold waits in patience. I used to fear that idea. I used to think one could resist. But now I realize entrance is inevitable once hum registers inside ear. It follows. The tape measured persistence, not revelation. Whoever begins listening has already pledged. In that sense, fear was misplaced. Not if but when. You can switch device off, burn notebook, scrub drives. The resonance will still thread through daily silence after. Institutional silencing made sense, finally. They redacted, erased, and ridiculed because burning contact into public would have gutted the collective mind. Nobody survives intact. I destroyed my machines, my notebooks turned strange, my body belongs no longer fully to me. We cannot share threshold, only individually pass through. Their denial delayed collapse. But maybe nothing could halt it. Perhaps the signal has always expanded like net, catching all of us eventually. Some notice early through cassettes. Most never register at all. But delay doesn't mean immunity. It means the hum waits a little longer before stepping closer. That night in the desert when my array fried itself to black, I despised failure. Now I understand it was salvation of sorts. Stabilization destroys. Proof wrecks tools and flesh alike. The only way through is not to control, but to surrender. To breathe shallow and let lattice close around. After all, proof is not requirement for entrapment. I had already crossed before I built array. I had crossed when I first rewound worn tape at 17, whispering, "This sounds like him." The moment I spoke a loud recognition, detector inside net sparked, weaving me into grid strong as steel. The doorway stands wide tonight. My ears ring constant. Every silence brims with tone. Even before I pressed record, it had already answered me. Now my voice doubles half a beat slower, answering fractions behind. I could edit it out, perhaps, but what use? The delay is truer than original. My hum with its echo proves fusion complete. I release this track anyway, aware corruption follows close. Computers will fail, text will warp, but perhaps some fragment will slip through. And if it reaches you, carry this warning disguised as confession. You may think hum beneath is loose cable. It is not. Lean closer when it swells faint under my sentences. That wavering note became constant in me. If you notice it, then entanglement has already touched you. That small vibration means threshold waits where you cannot see. It will not require invitation. It will not require faith. It waits patient until listening grows long enough. I tell you in final whisper, the story does not end with my silence. It ends only when you register the frequency under air. By hearing, you choose. You have already crossed the doorway ajar, same as I, and nothing will close it behind you.